Hey, come on in is right. Look, this has been an amazing day, and guess what? We're going to have another amazing day tomorrow, too. But right now, today, it is my pleasure to bring out to you the former CFTC chairman of the United States of America and the head of the U.S. Digital Dollar Project, Chris Giancarlo.
Thank you, Brad.
Chris, it's a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Sit right here.
That music was fantastic. I felt like a bullfighter. I've got a Toro.
Unbelievable. So, Chris, thank you for being here. It is
pleasure.
such a pleasure. We have so much to talk about, but let's start and level set for everybody here. You, first of all, I don't even know how you sleep because you've done so much in your life. You know, you're an author, former CFTC chairman, the Digital Dollar Project, a husband, a father, and
Guitar player,
and a good guitar player too, ladies and gentlemen. But look, let's talk about this. Let's start in the very first place of this. So, talk about why you wrote Crypto Dad. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, so, and I think there's a number of copies here, right? So
We've been giving them away, and they're going like crazy.
Okay, great. So I wrote Crypto Dad after 5 years in Washington, really for a number of reasons. One is I simply wanted to tell people that hadn't had that experience, people like me that had spent 30 years in the private sector, what Washington is like, what this parallel universe that is Washington is truly like from the inside out, especially for someone who's not a Washington insider, as I was not. Secondly, I wanted to tell the story of the launch of Bitcoin futures under our oversight at the CFTC. In 2017, when we made the decision to greenlight the launch of Bitcoin futures, we did it against enormous opposition. Opposition here in the United States from other market regulators, opposition here in the United States by some of the biggest financial players in the industry, some of the biggest banks. There were full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal addressed to me saying, do not allow Bitcoin futures to launch, you'll bring down Western society, or something pretty close to that. And opposition from overseas regulators, including especially Europeans. The Europeans who now have launched their own crypto legislation to get ahead of the United States. Back in 2017, they were worried the United States was going to get ahead of them. And we were ahead of them. At the end of the Trump administration, we had green-lighted Bitcoin futures, Ethereum futures at the CFTC, and we were getting ready for others as well.
That's amazing.
But unfortunately, elections have consequences, and now we're in a different cycle. But those are the reasons I wrote Crypto Dad, but there's one other reason, and that is because I wanted to tell people that notwithstanding the resistance that's coming out of Washington, the future of things of value will be digital networks. And it's going to be a kaleidoscope of different systems of value, some of which are going to be decentralized, like XRP. Others are going to be highly centralized. Some are going to be run by big tech companies, and others are going to be run by governments, like China and Europe. And the question, I think, for all of us is, what are going to be the values of those systems? Are they going to mirror the values of free enterprise, of economic liberty, or are they going to be closer to some of our economic adversaries that have a different system, a system where value is highly controlled by the state and people's use of that value is highly determined by state choices?
Well, let's talk about what you're doing now at the Digital Dollar Project. This is super important. We see so much happening on a geopolitical stage, and we'll get to some of those things here in a second, but talk to me about what you're doing at the Digital Dollar Project and why it is so very important.
Okay, so first of all, let me set the stage with just a little bit of history. 30 years ago, when the first wave of the internet came about, an internet of information, led by the United States, as Perianne Boring so well put it earlier, the United States was front and center. And by the United States, I mean not just the government, but the United States people were front and center in setting the values for that internet information, setting the values and building the institutions like ICANN and the Internet Society that made sure that the internet that we know is an internet that's of an open architecture, where closed societies can't wall off the internet and control information. That was a great example, a great action by our society to lead with our values. Well, where are we 30 years later? We're going into a new phase of the internet, an internet of value, where things of value are going to be put onto digital networks. But this time around, the United States is not front and center leading with our values, making sure that the internet of value is one that reflects those values of free enterprise, free trade, free economics. In fact, the people that are dominating the conversations these days are our economic adversaries like China and our economic competitors like Europe. And in those conversations, freedom of economic choice is not center stage. China wants to make sure that the internet of value is one that is safe for surveillance, safe for censorship, and safe for state control. And so I'm getting to the answer of why we formed the Digital Dollar Foundation, which is the founding for the Digital Dollar Project, because we believe that value is as much a social issue as it is a government issue. And the private sector needs to come together to hopefully set those values that can be incorporated into this digital system of value. So what do I mean by that? Well, we are formed to ask basically three questions. How do we future-proof the dollar for this coming world of digital networks of value? How do we preserve the dollar's reserve currency status in this future world? And how do we do so and preserve the values of economic liberty, of free trade, and free enterprise? And the way we do that at the Digital Dollar Project is by doing a whole series of pilot projects. We did the first ever pilot of a US retail central bank digital currency, looking at transactions in the remittance corridor between the United States and the Philippines. We've done wholesale experiments. Now, we do not advocate that the US deploy a central bank digital currency. We may well be able to do that using private sector initiatives. But we do advocate that the United States not cede the value discussion to our economic competitors and our economic adversaries in the way we are ceding the ground today. So we hope to be a stand-in for that conversation. And we've been very successful. We did the first ever conference on digital systems of value here in the United States last November in Washington. And we were sold out at capacity at 250. We had over 100,000 downloads of our materials. We had every major US government agency and many foreign central banks there for that conversation. And so we're doing very important work. I invite all of you to visit our material, our website at digitaldollarproject.org. And if you think there's something you'd like to get involved with, reach out to us, let us know. We've got important work to do, and we're going to keep doing it.
Well, I certainly want to help any way that I can tell you that, and I'm glad that you're here. Ripple has been one of the entities that has joined the Digital Dollar Project.
Indeed.
Tell us about that, Chris.
Yeah, so, look, I've been a believer in what Ripple's been building for some time. When I left government in 2019, in the spring of 2020, I published an article in a scholarly journal, the International Financial Law Review, analyzing XRP the way I would have analyzed it at the CFTC to determine where it fell on the securities commodities ledger. And using the same approach, concluded, and said so in that piece, that Ripple was not a security. Thank you.
So essentially, you could have saved Ripple $150 million.
Well, when Judge Torres's decision came out, I was flabbergasted because it was all kind of what I'd written 4 years before, or 3 years before. And I actually published the second piece in the IFLR, noting that, in fact, the same logic was there. We're in a very, very challenging phase in American history right now. I'm actually working on a fun piece right now for a semi-legal journal about law and culture. And it's looking at an Arthur Conan Doyle story from the turn of the century in which there's no Sherlock Holmes and there's no Professor Moriarty. What there are in this story are 4 automobiles, and they're the characters in the story. But in my research for this story, I learned a lot about the early innovation of the automobiles in Europe. And here, there's the point here. When the automobile, if you ever ask yourself, why are most of the terms for cars French terms? Chassis, coupes, cabriolets, what the French terms? Well, the reason is because Britain had a whole series of laws put in place by the dominant technology of the day, which was the railroad interests. And the railroads were worried about the rise of automobiles. So they wrote got Parliament to write a number of laws called the Locomotive Acts. And the Locomotive Acts actually required things like, for every automobile, somebody had to walk 30 feet in front of it holding a red flag, and it could move at no more than 4 miles an hour. And so the automobile explosion happened in Italy, it happened in France, it happened in Germany, and it actually didn't happen that much in the United States as well for other reasons. And Britain was really late to it. They were resisting this new innovation until suddenly they realized they couldn't resist it anymore. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where we are in the United States. In some ways, you can understand Britain because their railroad industry had been so successful. Well, the same is true in the United States today. Our 20th century financial system dominated the century and dominated America's development of globalization and export of our products and goods and services and intellectual property around the globe. For the last 60 years, American banking has been the world's colossus. The American central bank is the central bank of the world's central banks. The dollar is the dominant currency around the world, and U.S. financial market regulation has historically dictated to other market regulators. And the people running all of this are largely septuagenarians. Our chairman of our Federal Reserve, both our recent presidents, they grew up in a world of branch banking and paper checks and the dollar being dominant. And you can understand in their minds, there's nothing broken that needs to be fixed. One of my favorite authors is Doug Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And Doug Adams said, anything that's invented before you turn 35 is super cool. It's a subject of absolute fascination and may become your career objective in your life. But anything that's invented after you turn 35 is dangerous, it's suspect, and it needs to be suppressed. That's what's going on in Washington right now, right? In their minds, everything that got them to where they are, chairs of central banks, heads of banks, works. But technology doesn't care about all that. Technology changes everything. The Brits may have been the chief of the railroad engineers in the 19th century, but it was the automobile that was the instrument of the 20th century. Digital networks are coming. Whatever Elizabeth Warren may think, whatever Janet, and I'm not, these are all fine people, but the fact of the matter is they're in a mindset.
They don't think so, Chris.
People know me, I'm not a name caller. I just call it like it is. They're wrong, but they're nice people.
Yeah. Well, I love the analogy about the cars because it reminds me, back when cars were coming on, if you asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
Yeah.
We're in that moment right now, right? Yeah. They don't realize, the world doesn't realize largely that distributed ledger technology and blockchain can be an assistance. They don't know that that's the new car. That's the new vehicle for them, not a faster horse.
So, in fact, there was one member of parliament that voted against the repeal of the Locomotive Acts, and quote unquote, he said, are there not enough horses?
There it is. And that's the moment we're in today. It's funny how history repeats and often rhymes, and we were in that moment in this regard. So let's talk about, you have said this multiple times, and I find it so poignant to where we are today, and it is what happened with social media and the weaponization of government with social media. Can you talk about that and how it's relatable to why we don't want to see that duplicated with a digital dollar, whether it's a CBDC or a stablecoin?
So the evidence is increasingly clear that government has leaned on social media to present points of view that the government favors and to suppress points of view, whether it's the origin of the Wuhan, or the origin of COVID, or whether it's the efficacy of masks or any number of things. Right. And when we talk about, there is a lot of rightful criticism of the potential of a central bank digital currency to be built on the Chinese model of surveillance and suppression of speech. Notwithstanding the fact that we have constitutional protections of privacy, there's legitimate concern that if we were to roll out a digital dollar, it could be a surveillance tool. Yeah. Get it, totally get it. I've written more about that concern than perhaps anybody out there. Yet at the same time, there's this strange amnesia that says, but if we just do stable coins, it's all good because they're going to protect privacy. Well, in the stablecoin legislation that Perianne talked about, read it. The word privacy does not even appear. There's no requirement for stablecoins to maintain privacy. And if you're that government bureaucrat that's been telling Facebook what stories to cover or YouTube what cover, you're going to love stablecoins because you're going to say to them, hey, you know, we don't want people buying ammunition. Hey, you know, we don't want you giving money to that man with the orange hair, or whatever some bureaucrat thinks is, you know, outside. So the concerns about censorship, privacy, and money extend whether it's done by the private sector, whether it's done by the public sector.
Well, okay, so now how do we get across this gap? Like, you know, from the digital dollar project point of view, who still needs to be involved at this conversation? Who in the US, who still needs to come to this table to really find what is that meaningful way forward to have a stable coin?
Well, Perianne's absolutely right once again. We're absolutely in the battle of the times. You know, there's that old phrase that says, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. That was what Gandhi said about the revolution in India. We're absolutely in the third phase, the fight you phase, and the fight is at hand. Others have said from this stage to you, and I'm going to reiterate, if you haven't called your senator or congressman, you must. We could lose this fight. Yeah. We must fight this good fight.
Absolutely.
The future, what's in balance right now, there's no question that the future of the way we hold and store and transfer value is going to move off of the balance sheets of proprietary commercial institutions where it currently resides onto digital networks. And it's going to be a kaleidoscope of digital networks. It's going to be some run by governments. China's digital yuan is being rolled out as an export product. It's only a matter of time before countries in South America adopt white label versions of China's digital yuan and make them sanction proof and outside of US sanctions. It's only a matter of time before Europe rolls out its digital euro with not the same type of draconian control features, but in fact may become the way that if there's a run on stable coins, they will move from stable coins to a sovereign digital currency and maybe the digital euro. So I think Europe's got a lot going on with their digital currency. So the future is going to be a kaleidoscope of state-run systems, of decentralized systems, and of some systems that are very centralized by big tech companies. So that's inevitable. What is not inevitable is whether that new future is going to have the same open architecture and freedom that we expect from the internet, or whether it's going to be one that's going to be highly controlled and centralized. We are in right now, in an internet of value, we're in a fight right now for what are going to be the values of those systems. And we, the people, need to speak up.
No question about it. And I do encourage everybody, I know as you do, and Perianne, it's been a theme for the day. It should be the theme going forward. I have to do it too. This is not me, you know, telling anybody, but I got to take this advice too. I will be going home and calling and asking who I can meet with at my senator's office to begin this conversation. And I promise you, I'm going to follow through and do it. And I hope everybody here does it too.
Yeah, here.
So when you talk about this kaleidoscope, I can see it. There is, there's going to be multiple protocols out here. There's going to be multiple different tokens. And the stablecoin bills out here, although they're missing privacy, they really allude, it's not just about a digital dollar stablecoin. These stablecoin bills are tokenization bills.
Yeah.
And it is about getting the traditional markets tokenized. Yeah. So this is a massive piece of legislation that's going to be done when it gets done.
And don't get me wrong, I support the stablecoin bills.
Yes.
I would like to see the privacy protections enhanced.
Added in.
But I support them. And I support in fact, I'm on record of having supported a number of the bills. I was actually asked to put my support for the Senate bill in writing and presented to the Ag Committee, which I did last year.
Well, as both of us understand, there's a protocol world after all, right? And all of this happening, and multiple different kinds of stable coins, obviously, that exist, whether they're commodity stable coins, fiat-backed stable coins, derivatives, stocks, bonds, and so on. You look at that wide range of all of these things, and that just sounds like a giant new use case being created for the world here, and especially if you go back to the dollar stable coins and you allow this private issuers like financial institutions to have this granted access to create a Bank of America stable coin, a PNC or Wells Fargo, right? So if we have these new use cases for these digital dollars, those entities will be required to have a qualified custodian and hold one-to-one or a surplus. But we're in a situation right now, Chris, where, at home, domestically, and geopolitically, there are a lot of things headed towards an intersection that doesn't look very healthy for us. Just speak to that moment, what that looks like from your digital dollar project chair. Yeah,
it's funny. History is a series of contractions and expansions. If you look at the U.S. approach to money, during the 19th century, it was a very expansive notion. We had states issuing currencies, we had railroad companies issuing currencies, you had mines issuing currencies, and you had the federal government issuing currencies. And then we went through a period of high restriction, which reached an apogee in the 1930s when the Roosevelt administration actually banned ownership of gold. Everything had to be based on a federal notion of value. We've expanded that once again. We have a much more liberal approach to that, and we're in a global world where there's many different instruments of value that are competing. The question is whether we go back to a restrictive period again or whether we go to an open period. And what's going to make the difference is the people. Yeah. At the end of the day, politics does respond. If we're asleep at the switch, if we allow the politicians to have their own way, they will look to restrict things down, because once you have less choice, politicians have more control over it, right?
Unfortunately, with the way things are today, and if we look at the printing, the inflation here at home, we look at the geopolitical conflicts that are happening, the advancement of the Chinese digital yuan, we don't want to see that get white labeled in other countries and so on. Can they avoid, you know what I mean? Like standing on the sideline and avoid being a part of this innovation? You can't.
No, and honestly, they have the right to exercise their economic clout. We don't agree with their value set, but they have a right to we should just be countering that with a better set of values. The sad part is we're not doing that, and so they're dominating the conversation.
So at this point, if we look at, if we just look at the things that are happening, just the inflation, the money printing, we all in this room know that it's unsustainable. And we don't get an email when it hits that wall. There's a line in the sand when it comes to money. And this is so funny, because as involved as the construct of the financial system is, there's an imaginary line in the sand called confidence. And once it's lost,
absolutely,
that piece of paper isn't worth anything.
That's right.
And what I see coming, and I want you to speak to this from just from the Digital Dollar Project. What I'm seeing is this unavoidable moment in the front of us, and there has to be someone at some point has to come forward and allow these new use cases to be happening, like stablecoins, private issuers, because I see like this hyperinflation moment. Now, I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I don't know whether it slides greatly or what's that scale look like. I can't tell you. But everybody knows that it's a high probability of happening. We just don't know how bad it gets, right? But if you introduce this ability for these new issuers to have a stable coin, then they are the ones that soak up like a sponge or a bulkhead that catch these hyperinflated dollars that are coming back home. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you put your finger on it. I think the biggest threat to the American way of life is government money printing.
Yeah.
Everyone here, if you reach in your pocket and you have dollars there, 1 out of every 4 of those dollars was printed in the last 3 years. That means that if you had $100 3 years ago, it's worth 75 today. It's simply unsustainable. It's destroying the very fabric. And if you add that with the 2 other issues that I find very destructive, is the miseducation, deliberate miseducation of our population by teaching them what to think, not how to think, and the real failure of our schooling system.
Yes. You. Hello. Hello.
And the real overuse of economic sanctions, the sort of profligate misuse of economic sanctions as U.S. foreign policy, has really diminished, I think, the dollar. So to understand what's happened to the dollar, you first have to understand why it became the world's reserve currency. It became the world's reserve currency because at the end of World War II, the United States was the dominant economic power with a fully intact industrial base, with self-sustaining energy production, and a highly educated workforce that was innovative, highly productive, and hardworking. All of those things are being diminished right now. I mentioned the school system because it's diminishing the innovative nature of our own homegrown talent. Because of our restrictions on energy production, we have the ability to be self-sustaining, but we're not allowing ourselves to be self-sustaining. And the profligate misuse of the dollar in global sanctions has made many countries in the world wary of the dollar and wanting to find alternatives to the dollar. And then, of course, the profligate money printing. These are not sustainable. These things alone can diminish the dollar significantly to the point where the world is searching for other reserve items. The other point is that the dollar, if the dollar becomes an analog instrument in a digital world, it will struggle to find its place. If the dollar is not a programmable instrument, if the dollar is not a method for people to convert from in a stable coin is a centralized stable coin is a corporate obligation, right? It may be on a digital network, but at the end of the day, it's a corporate obligation. We've seen runs on stablecoins. We saw a run on USCC. We've seen runs on Tether. When there's a run on bank money, what do? People go to the bank and the ATM and they take physical possession. But they're really doing something bigger than that. They're actually converting a bank liability into a sovereign liability. That's the safety you're getting. You're actually converting your money at Citibank is not stacks of $100 bills in Citibank's basement. It's an IOU from Citibank. And if you're worried about Citibank solvency, you want to get out of the Citibank IOU and get into a government IOU. Well, with stable coins, you're still transferring value. You're getting value in their network and whatever reserves they say they're holding, but ultimately it's still a commercial liability. And if there's a run on that platform, what you want to do the same thing you did with account-based money. You want to go from a corporate liability into a sovereign liability. And if there's a digital dollar, you'll be able to do that. But if there's not, you're going to go to a digital euro. And so if there's a run on stablecoins licensed under this new legislation, we might see de-dollarization. And that's another threat to the dollar, another reason why we need to modernize the dollar. You know, it's interesting. The reason we have what we call a dollar is because when the United States, it's not called a dollar in the Constitution. When the United States wanted to create money, it looked around and said, what's the most sophisticated, technologically advanced money in the world? And that money was the dollar, but it wasn't the American dollar because it didn't exist yet. It was the Spanish dollar. And the reason why the Spanish dollar was the most technologically sophisticated is because it was minted with New World silver, which was more consistently pure than Old World silver, meaning it used less alloy and it was more fungible one coin to the next. But more importantly, it was minted in such a way that can be broken into 8 equal pieces, known as pieces of 8, making it fractionable and easier to use in trade. And you know, we liked that so much that we called ours the dollar. We used the same symbol, which is the S with the 2 lines through it, which appeared on the Spanish dollar, and we made the dollar dividable into 8 equal pieces, half dollars, quarter dollars, and what used to be called bits, which were 2 halves to a quarter, divided into 8. So we modeled the dollar on what was the most technologically sophisticated instrument of its time, and yet now we're going into a whole new digital network technology architecture of money, and we're sitting back saying, nah, no problem, the dollar's good, we don't need to change anything. Well, that's not going to work out too well. So the dollar is under threat because of profligate spending, because the dumbing down of our own domestic workforce, because of our no longer insisting that we be energy sufficient, and because we're not technologically advancing the dollar into a new digital age.
It is a remarkable moment we're in. And you talked about de-dollarization. So let's talk about BRICS and the BRICS coalition. And outside of BRICS, there is a Project Sandman that has over 100 nations around the world that want to de-dollarize too. And the plan is to simultaneously de-dollarize. That shows the sickness that they're tired of the dollar's reign, right? And we look at the sanctions recently in the Russia conflict, when the U.S. SWIFT sanctions happening there. The rest of the world, I mean, who would have thought that Janet Yellen could be the greatest advertiser to join BRICS? Who'd have thought? Because they're not participating in this, and they think that the more they keep trying to clamp everybody down, it's really just telling everybody, but there is another choice. And that new choice is a payment system that is built by the BRICS coalition, Chris. And look, to your point about the dollar and how it became what it is, you know, the last 5 currencies that served as the world reserve currency, 2 of them, I think it was, if my memory serves me correct, Netherlands and Portugal, don't hold me to it, had a lifespan of 80 years. US dollar is at 80 years right now. How much longer do we have? Can we, and I know the government, you know, nothing, then all of a sudden something, right? I understand that. But we are really facing something here, and how much longer can we sustain this moment we're in? It can't be sustained.
Throughout most of human history, almost all currencies have been grounded in some commodity. Whether the commodity was sheep or cattle, or clay tablets, or gold or silver, almost throughout all of human history, all currencies have had some grounding in some commodity, and by commodity, at least historically, has meant something came out of the ground. In fact, when the dollar went off the gold standard in the 1970s, many argue it actually went onto an oil standard, and that the dollar still remains grounded in some commodity. When we looked at Bitcoin futures in 2017, I, as the head of the US Commodity Futures Trading Commission, a commission that was created because the US government realized they could not put the new commodities of indexes on interest rates under the SEC, because it was so essential for the dollar off the gold standard to have those interest rates priced in dollars. What do I mean by that? I should break that down a little bit. The reason why the dollar is, one of the reasons why the dollar is world reserve currency is because you can hedge its movements against other currencies. You can hedge the movement of interest rates in deep and liquid markets based in Chicago with interest rate futures and currency futures. And so the US government created the CFTC, a separate agency, to safeguard that, because effectively it safeguards the dollar's status as a reserve currency. When we were looking at Bitcoin futures, I saw it as the world's first digital commodity. Well, most of the world's commodities are priced in dollars. Oil, gold, silver, soybeans, wheat, the things that the rest of the world needs are priced in dollars, which means they need to hold dollars to buy those things they need. And I thought to myself, we're now going to have digital commodities. We better make sure they're priced in dollars as well. And when we think about the fact that the world has always grounded currencies in a commodity, is it such a leap to say that maybe in the 21st century, they might ground them in digital commodities? Oh, El Salvador is already doing that. And if the dollar, because of profligate money printing, people see it as unstabilized and once again need to be stabilized with a commodity, could it be a digital commodity? It very well could. So we've done this grand experiment for about 60 years now of 50 years now of depegging the dollar from commodities. Well, we may need to repeg it to a commodity in the future to regain its strength.
Hello. Hello. Well, Chris, that brings me to this. We talk about this quite a bit, me and my friends here. And when I think about what you referenced with the gold standard and then changing over to the petrodollar agreement, Saudi Arabia has started doing deals in Chinese yuan and showing that is not exclusive in honoring that exclusivity agreement for military protection for the United States, Chris. And when I think of that, I say to myself, to your point, I think you have to go to some kind of a digital tokenized commodity to back the dollar again. But again, you have to go another step further and you have to underpin it with some kind of value protocol, if you might know one that we could use that would help track it all. You guys might know one? Because I feel like what the mistake could have been, dare I say it, is moving to a petrodollar agreement, even though at the time we had the power and strength to offer that military protection. In this day and age, now those countries have the advantage to dump that dollar in those bonds and harm all of us. But if we use what you're talking about and use a digital commodity to back the dollar and put it on a value protocol that just happens to have a decentralized ledger, right? Then we can underpin the dollar for the next 150 years. What say you at the digital dollar project?
So I say yes, and let's add one other thing to that. Let's also win this war with our values.
Yes.
If China wants to make their digital yuan based upon surveillance, censorship, and control, go for it, guys. If Europe wants to make theirs on government censorship, but not commercial sensitive, because they're highly sensitive to commercial exploitation of data, but they're fine with letting government have the data, fine. The way we win this battle is we make sure that dollar-based digital currencies, whether they're run by the private sector or the government, must protect privacy, must protect economic freedom,
Amen.
Must protect economic choice. Let's win on the values and on the value.
Yeah, win on the values and the value. I love it. Absolutely right. Look, first of all, Chris, I appreciate you being here. You know I love speaking with you. But we're going to have a special opportunity tonight. And tell it, where are we going tonight?
So we're going to the House of Blues, man.
Yeah, man. I love it.
I've got my Gibson SG.
Come on in.
You got your drums.
Yes.
What are we going to play?
What are we going to play? What would they like to hear, you know?
Pump it up.
Pump it up. We are the champions. Absolutely right.
Well, I'll tell you what, I like all of those choices. So if you folks come out and join us tonight, we'll put them on.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to put on a heck of a show. And you know Brad Garlinghouse is going to be there. Give it up for him. Shout out to Brad Garlinghouse for showing up today and showing everybody love in this room. And by the way, shout out to Chris Giancarlo for being here today. Give it up. Give it up.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much, man. Let's do it.
See you tonight.
Come on over, House of Blues.